couple weeks ago, as you probably saw, I went on a camping trip where I was going to use a quinzee for a shelter. I got too impatient and the quinzee collapsed, which led to a fairly cold, miserable night. I had a free weekend, so I decided to give it another shot. Hopefully this time it'll be a little bit more successful.
Looks like somebody else has been making quinzees. I'm not sure if they're hollowed out yet. I'll have to take a look. Not been hollowed out yet. Wonder if they're going to try and make an igloo or something right there.
This time there was a small trail that had been made by skiers and perhaps snowshoers. Problem was it was too small for both my snowshoes and the sled to fit into well, so I kind of had to work around it. It actually made life a little bit more difficult. When the sled bounces in and out of the ruts, sometimes you lose a little cargo. It's only my sleeping bag, not that important. Okay, well, maybe it's worth going back and getting it. Before I left last time, I rebuilt my snow pile. I figured if 3 weeks of sintering wasn't enough, it probably was never going to work for me. My pile of snow was sitting under 2 to 3 feet of fresh powder. No shortage of snow this time. I got plenty of snow in my sled too, so here I'm trying to empty the snow out from my sleeping pad and anything else that I don't want to be wet. I got here a little earlier this time. That gives me a little bit more time to let my snow cave sinter. I started by packing down the fresh snow on top of the pile. Then I needed to dig out a fire ring and a little place to move around, so I just piled that up on top of the quinzee. Then I just moved it into place where I wanted it with the snowshoes. Hopefully stamping on it will make it sinter more quickly. If nothing else, it gives the pile the shape I want it. With the snow all piled, it was time to gather some wood. This little buck saw I made works pretty good. I noticed this tree had a lot of dry bark, so I saved that by sticking it on top of the stump next to the tree. That'll come in handy when I go to build a fire. Dead aspen cuts really easy, so it didn't take me long to get this tree cut through. Aspens are also light enough that I can just carry the whole tree with me as I go. Gotta get the snowshoes situated correctly though. If you watch closely, you'll notice that I managed to sweep my dry bark right off into the snow right here. Gotta watch both the front and the rear end. I still had plenty of light, so I made sure I cut enough firewood. Didn't want to get cold tonight.
So this stuff right here is very good for starting fires. Try and put it someplace where it won't get wet. Maybe on the coat. So last time I used this bark right here to start the fire. It worked pretty good.
The standing dead trees had lots of dry branches from being in the sunlight, so I made sure that I collected these in a place where they would stay dry. They'll help me get my fire started for sure. As always, I'm tough on my gear, including my cameras. With the small branches gathered, now I was just cutting the bigger pieces into logs. The last trip, I got impatient building my fire, so it took a little longer than it should have, and a few more strikes of the lighter. So this time I spent some significant time getting the teepee just right.
My daughter made these for me. Got them for Christmas. I think I've got dry enough stuff in there that I could get it started without. But since she made it for me, I may as well use it.
When you're making a fire in difficult conditions, it's really important that you have a good supply of small, dry branches you can place wherever the fire decides to burn. If you pull them off the stack, you'll just cause lots of havoc. With the fire going, I got the rest of the trees cut up into logs, and they're propped up on sticks so they won't come into too much contact with the snow. This time I managed to wait about an hour and a half before I couldn't stand it anymore and started shoveling out my quinzee. Fortunately, the layer where I was mostly building the shelter had been sitting for about 3 weeks, so it was plenty solid. You couldn't hardly dent it with the shovel, but the snow saw worked really well at moving big chunks. Then I just used the shovel to move the chunks out of the way. I make my entrances taller than most people, because I hate laying down in the snow building a snow cave. This allows me to crouch while I'm building the cave. Keeps me a lot drier. I got it about as big as I wanted. Now it's just a matter of putting the final touches on it with the shovel and getting the loose snow scooped out. Here you can see how hard the snow actually is. I could have made it taller, but I wasn't sure how stable the new layers of snow were, so I just kept it in the old pile. If I come back later, I'll definitely make it a lot taller. I'm getting the last little bit of snow scraped out, then it'll be time to cook some dinner. It ended up about 8 feet long and about 3.5 feet tall, which was a lot more spacious than my snow trench.
Plenty of coals, time to cook some kebabs.
I'd cut a couple of green aspen sticks that wouldn't burn up in the coals, and then the plan was just to lay the kebabs on those, close enough to the coals that they'd cook fairly well. It didn't work quite as well as I'd hoped. A couple of times the kebabs fell into the ashes, but they didn't end up gritty, so it was a win. A little bit of camp seasoning never hurt anyone.
That one. Maybe a little crispier than I would like, but it should be good on the inside.
The coals weren't exactly evenly spread out, but it actually worked pretty well because the kebabs would get done one at a time, and then I'd just move the next one towards the hot spot. I also brought a little dessert this time. It's an apple that I cored and then put some cinnamon and nutmeg in it, and then just wrapped it in foil and tossed it in the fire. Kind of like an apple pie. It was pretty tasty. There was about a 15 to 20 mile an hour breeze blowing this whole evening. That makes things substantially cooler, so it's time to get the shelter ready. One thing about snow caves is they tend to block the wind really well. In fact, a lot of times it's so quiet you can't hear anything that's going on outside. I put down a plastic tarp. I'm not sure whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. The problem with plastic tarps is they really slide on the snow, so it's hard to keep it spread out as you start to move around. If I'm camping with a group, a lot of times I'll pack up a bale of straw and just put that on the ground for insulation, but for just me, this pad worked fine. I'm using my black sled for the door. It definitely wasn't airtight, which I don't think you want. With the pad in place, then it was just time to get my shoes off, get my sleeping bag laid out. I could hear the wind howling most of the night, but I didn't ever feel more than the slightest breeze.
Well, 6 in the morning, trying to decide whether it's time to get up or not yet. It was definitely much more comfortable than the night in the snow trench. Much better than the last trip.
It doesn't get light till after 7:30, but like always, my Saturdays are pretty full, so I needed to get on the road while it was still dark. Getting camp torn down is always a challenge. I tend to leave something behind every time. The underside of my foam pad was pretty wet, but the top side stayed dry and I stayed nice and warm. I put what was left of my firewood back in the cave to keep it somewhat dry in case I want to come back later this winter. Then I just used the chunks from the snow cave to build a door to keep out any snow. That way, again, if I want to come dig it out bigger or use it again, I should just be able to pull those blocks out and be ready to go. With everything gathered up, I just put my snowshoes on and headed back to the truck. It was just getting light enough that I didn't need the light to get out. However, I needed it to film. This was a much more successful trip. Glad it turned out that way. I imagine I got another couple camping trips in me before spring hits.